Hey everyone, and I'll be talking about my favorite book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's book 8, called The Hounds. This might contain spoilers, including the Kharkanas trilogy and obviously up to the Crippled God, so fair warning. This might have some small details from books past book 8, so be ready to jump out of this now if you don't want any spoilers after Told the Hounds. The second point I'd like to make is that what I'm presenting here is basically a theory in the context of literary criticism. What I mean is that I don't want to say that what I'm presenting here is the way of interpreting Told the Hounds. Is just one way, I like to call it one framework, through which we can find meaning and beauty and an aesthetic sense to this book. Now, I'm sure there are many other ways of doing this and of interpreting this novel. This one in particular, which is sort of experimental in some aspects, which gives it a bit more room for interpretation in the context that I'll be discussing. So this is just one way to do this. I myself can interpret this book in different ways. And most important, I don't mean by this that this is what the author intended. I don't claim to know the mind of the author of Told the Hounds. This is just my way of looking at it, and I think it's worth it because it's useful. It allows to bring together many of the points of the novel in a very interesting way. So look at this as a framework in the context of literary criticism. It goes without saying that in this context, criticism refers more to analysis than to stating things that I disagree with. So, to begin with, let's simplify the novel, Told the Hounds, to a single concept to begin with, just for the sake of argument. Let's say Told the Hounds is about legacy. It's an exploration of legacy. And this exploration will be made through the character of Anomander Rake. Now this presents the narrative or the author with a challenge. Anomander Rake is an extremely old character. We don't really know how old he is, even though some characters estimate he's at least 100,000 years. It's very clear from the context of the book that that's what those characters with their limited knowledge think is the case. And Rake himself may not know with precision how old he is. But in any event, he has lived very many standard human lives. So if we were to present the entire trajectory of Rake's life, it will be inconvenient because, number one, it takes away the mythological aura around him. That is one of the elements that makes him such a powerful character. But it's not just that. The point here is that the Book of the Fallen is not about Rake. It's about a lot of things, but not about one single character. It can't be pinned down to one single character. So we need to come up with a more clever way of expressing this sense of legacy of what Rake is going to leave to the world. And to do this, I think the strategy used here is one I like to call extrapolation. You don't tell the entire story of somebody, of something, of some process. You give a series of points, important points and details, and then you let the reader extrapolate or interpolate what happens between the points. So in Toll the Hounds, we see the last portion of the life of Rick. The culmination of this life ends with a gesture of selfless, altruistic sacrifice to mend the breach between him and Mother Dark, the Bystandee and Mother Dark, and to mend the errors, the mistakes that were made by Dracanus, placing the gate of Gralgaline inside the sword, and doing this gamble, trying to defeat chaos, something like that. Although this happens in the very last chapters of the book, I would argue that since the very beginning we know this is going to happen. We just don't accept it. Why do I say that we know? Well, if you read carefully throughout the book, it's clear that Rake is preparing for something. The atmosphere, his mood, him talking to his closest confidants, and the Stilan, Spinogdura, the priestess. It's very clear that he's setting the field to do something that's going to be enormous. But above all this, there's this sense throughout the parts of Reg during the novel in which it becomes apparent that he's kind of saying goodbye to things in general. There is this overwhelming feel of nostalgia. And we know, we have a feeling that he's going to die or to be transformed into something different that from which there's no coming back. And the further we go into the books, it becomes evident. Of course, we don't accept that because how can that be that the most awesome character, well, not the most awesome, but the most powerful character that we see since book 1. How can this be that Erickson is going to kill this guy? How? So we resist convincing ourselves that, yeah, he's going to die. Now, this last portion of his life tells us a lot about the kind of person he was, he is, and here and has been through many generations of both Andy and humans and whatever. And this is the last portion of the puzzle. It tells us a lot about his character. There are many flashbacks and conversations between him and Mother Dark and other characters close to him. And this gives a lot of information on his character and on who he is, but there's an important point here. We don't know how Ray got to this place of being probably the most powerful ascendant in the Malazan universe. We don't know where he came from. And for this extrapolation method or interpolation method to work, we need at the very least a point that shows how he begins this journey, so that we can create some sort of shape or form. Of course, by book 8, the author has been dropping many hints on things that Reg has done. So we kind of have some of the points in the middle of this curve. But we need a start. So the author does not give a 5-chapter flashback into how Rake started this journey. What does he do? He mirrors the life of Rake into his son, Nimander Golith. If you look at Nimander, he's in the position when he's beginning a journey to gain leadership. And in this context, that leadership can only be achieved by force of character. By this, I don't mean by having an abrasive, violent character, but by showing character and by showing that you can lead others, that you care about those others, and that you actually have some form of moral code that you abide by. So I know a lot of people struggle with the Andy chapters of Toll the Hounds, but if you look at through this light, with this light, through this lens, it becomes a lot more clear what those chapters are about. You are not just looking at Nimander going around with the dicey companions going back to Black Coral to meet with Rake. It's not that. What you're looking at is a mirror to the beginning of Rake's life. How he started, and how this enormous power that he now has been accumulating and has been consolidated because of his character, and let's say like that, by his principles, whatever they are. One gets a sense by book 8 that it involves a lot of behaving with fairness, trying to be as just as possible, not imposing yourself on everyone just because you have the power, but trying to respect people, even if that means, even if these people have a lot less power than you in the Malazan sense of the word, which is magic and ascendancy and all that. But of course, this has parallels with real life and real life power, be it military power, political power, economic power, but not imposing yourself on others just because you can. This is very apparent between Rake and Nimander. In the case of Nimander, my first thought is, why is this guy entertaining Clip? For most of the book, I didn't know the Geist group were stronger than Clip. But we reached a point in which it became apparent that this group of Tight Sandy were not just kids. And of course, later in The Crippled God, we realized they were all aligned, soul taken, extremely powerful. But this puts the novel into context. So why are they putting up to Clip? Well, in a sense, it's because why would we screw this guy just because we can? And again, there's constantly this feeling of Nimander feeling the weight of, well, what if my decisions impact my followers in a negative way? He's constantly thinking about that. What if I don't make the right decision? What if the people around me suffer because of what I decide? What if I'm wrong? So these are, I would like to argue, the 2 points that allow us to interpolate the life of Rake and thus imply the legacy of this character. Of course, none of this has any sense if it isn't contrasted with the predominant theme in the novel. This theme is obviously grief. The grief caused by the breach, by the conflict between Mother Dark and the Teist, and Rake and Mother Dark. Now, it isn't clear what exactly happened, but we have some hints that are very useful. They are easy to miss because some of these hints are of Mother Dark seemingly speaking from nowhere, speaking in the middle of the text. Sometimes it seems Anomander is remembering what happened. And sometimes it seems she is actually manifesting in the Malazan world and is speaking to someone. And clearly, by the end of this, we realize that at some point it's her speaking through Aranatha, one of the Teist companions of Nimander. So, what are these hints? Well, I often call this a hidden conversation throughout the books. So she goes like, I forsake you, Anomander, blood of Tiam. I deny my first children all. You shall wander the realms, bereft of purpose. Your deeds shall avail you nothing. Your lives shall spawn death unending. The dark, my heart, is close to you all. This is like 25% into the book. This right here is where this rupture between them manifests. This is it. Of course, later, like 90% into the book, we return to this conversation from a different perspective. Now here it's Nimander listening to Aranatha. It isn't exactly clear that she's Mother Dark yet, but at least I had my suspicion on something like that before it was made explicit. And it goes like, and Nimander heard her whisper, the gate. How? Oh, my dearest son, oh, Anomander. This is after the sacrifice inside Dragniper happens. Rake sacrifices his soul and smashes the door with his soul. Of course, this places Mother Dark in a very complicated position. She doesn't accept the sacrifice of Rake. For all we know, his soul will go into oblivion. Obviously, he's not going through Hood's Gate. He's not going to Kural Galain because it's still closed. So essentially, and we have precedent of ascendants going to the god or goddess that leaves their house. It's what was supposed to happen with Heboric and Fenner. And if we remember the fact, Rake is actually the mortal sword of Dark. But if a god does not embrace the soul of their follower, as far as we know, that the follower falls into oblivion, the soul disappears, so Mother Dark is forced, Rake forces the hand of Mother Dark here. A couple pages later we read, and Nimander heard her say, "Oh, my son, I accept." This is Mother Dark accepting the sacrifice of Rake. And this, in my opinion, is a complete evolution through all the hounds. We go from manifest grief to a sense of closure, catharsis, reconciliation, above all. And it actually doesn't end here. We read in one of the following chapters an interesting Teist Andy saying, "Speak truth, grow still, until the water is clear between us." What do I find so interesting about this snippet? Number one, speak truth. To me, it means remaining close to your values, whatever they are. Grow still. What's important about grow still? Well, if you have read Kharkanas, you know that the last name of Anomander, Rake, is a contraction of Urakis. And the meaning of that word means strength in growing still. So that's a direct allusion of the last name of Anomander. And then comes the metaphor with water, until the water is clear between us. This is a metaphor in which when things are not fine, when two people are in conflict, the waters are said not to be clear. And of course, if things get mended, if things get fixed, then waters are clear again between them. So here we have Endest Silan, which, if you remember from Kharkanas, was probably the first human into which Mother Dark made some sort of permanent connection with. In Kharkanas, Mother Dark manifested through him. She didn't take over his willpower, but she could see through him. And so we have Endest Silan after presumably many thousands of years. Don't know exactly how much, although I could estimate, but after a long time, he's debating, kind of praying. For you, Mother, he did this. For us, he did this. He has brought us all home. He has brought us all home. And then Mother Dark replies, and she replies in his mind, and her voice raising from the depths below, from the river where he had found his strength, the dozen reel that runs through this manifestation of Crowgline in Black Coral. His strength to hold one last time, as his Lord had asked him to, as his Lord had known he would do. She said, I understand. Come to me then. The water between us and the Silan is clear. The water is clear. So this culminates this final catharsis and reconciliation thread. Starts with Nimander, then we have to extrapolate, and we return to Anomander and the last moments of his life, his sacrifice, and what comes after. He mends this bridge between Mother Dark and Taistandi. She accepts the sacrifice, she accepts the gamble. And then Nimander, because it becomes way too evident that he is the son of Rake. He has many of the traits of Rake. He's followed by the Taistandi of Black Coral, including the seconds in command of Anomander. Well, the second in command was evidently Korlat. But not just Korlat, but Spinak Durav was also extremely well regarded by everybody. And they all deferred to him, because they saw something in him that they could see in Rake. And this is what makes this analogy so explicit. But we're missing one point here. As I've discussed in other videos, we are still talking about extremely powerful beings, longevity. They are soul taken, they will magic, they live hundreds of generations more than humans. So this never works by itself. There needs to be a counterbalance. And that counterbalances the missing piece in this puzzle. This piece is called Harlow. Harlow here is a kid, age 6, that has to go through an ordeal for nothing really in particular. It just shows the horrible things that happen in our world without really any meaning. He essentially goes, number one, he's rejected by his mother. Number two, he's essentially sold into slavery. He faces a lot of hostility of people willing to do harm to him. He has to go through a lot. But he himself shows a lot of character. And in my view, the arc of Harlow is essentially a compression of both the arc of Anomander and Nimander put together to a much smaller scale. This kid, he essentially does everything that goes on in this arc that I've been describing about this powerful die standee. He's rejected by mother, goes into hardship. He has some advantages because he's smart, but he has a lot of disadvantages because he's just 6 years old, and 6 years old should not be working in mines, in slavery, like in this case. But just like Anomander and Nimander, he shows an extremely intense sense of what's right and what's not, an adherence to a code, a lot of character. And yeah, he pushes forward through all this ordeal. And I think that through Harlow, Erikson manages to bridge together these two plot lines that are like mirror images, Anomander and Nimander. Of course, there's a very suggestive theme here, because you have Mother Dark that has this sort of deity status of metaphysical entity. And the counterpart for Harlow is Stannis. Stannis is a normal human. She's courageous, strong, extremely skilled with the sword, but is still just a person. And she actually is the biological mother of Harlow. Of course, we later learn that Anomander is not actually the son of Mother Dark. It becomes clear at least in Kharkanas, but one more or less gets an idea that Anomander being the son of Dark doesn't sound so literal, even in the Book of the Fallen. So, even though there are differences in scale, in scope, this is very suggestive. It's very clear, at least to me, that there is an implication being made how this arc about this guy trying to mend the differences with his metaphysical mom, echoing this kid trying to go back to his mom. Now, Harlow's arc also ends in finally this state of catharsis and reconciliation that I talked about. Of course, Harlow survives, unlike Anomander. But at least we see how these threads converge to the same point. Now, for the sake of completion and balance, I don't want to read all those passages of the powerful people without reading the passages of the small people, which are just as important in my opinion. So how do we see this from the perspective of Harlow? Well, it goes like this. At last, of course, I love that this is crop narrating. This is awesome for me. At last, we come to a small child, walking into a dwelling school, passing through gilded streams of sunlight. He halts 10 paces from a woman that is sitting on a bench, and he says something then. Something without sound. Now, Erickson stops there, and he doesn't tell you what Harlow said in silence. Of course, you know it's Harlow because he's going into a dueling school of stunning. That's clear. But he doesn't tell you. And you want to know, but you have to read a couple paragraphs before you know that. That's just messing with your brain, with your mind. So then it continues. A moment later, two imps struggle into view and stop in their tracks, staring at Harlow. And they squeal and rush toward him. The woman looks up. She's silent for a long time, but she knew and Hinty clutched the boy. And then a sob escapes her. And she makes as if to turn away, but Harlow will have none of that. Nope. I've come home. That's what this is. I'm coming home. She cannot meet his eyes, just weeping nonetheless. She waves a hand. You don't understand, Harlow. That time, I have no good memories of that time. Nothing good came of it. Nothing. This is of course in reference to the highly disturbing rape scene in Memories of Ice. Very complex topic, complex in the sense that it can be seen in from so many perspectives in terms of the victim and thus affected. Then continuing. That's not true, he shouts, Harlow shouts, close to tears. That's not true, there was me. Now it goes back to Silara. We saw the other side of the argument, not the argument of the possible positions into this from the side of Silara back in the Bone Hunters. Silara had a similar situation, and she left her kid with a couple back in Seven Cities. In that case, we see Lorik saying that she should keep the kid because that's what she should do. And I think it's Barthel McCart that tells him, calm down, mate. You don't have to tell people how to handle this kind of situation. It's very reminiscent of the debate in some parts of the world concerning this subject. And that's why it's so important that it is Silara that comes into this sentence now. As Silara now knew some doors, you cannot hold back. Speaking about doors, there's a clear parallel between this door and the gate that Anomander just broke open a couple chapters ago. Bold as truth, some doors get kicked in. Stony did not know how she would manage, but she would. And so she met her son's eyes in a way that she had never before permitted herself to do. And that pretty much did it. And what was said by Harlow in silence as he stood there in the moments before he was discovered, sneaky crook now telling us what Harlow actually said. Why it was this. See, Bainisk, this is my mother. And so, I believe that if you read carefully, the parallels are just too strong to be a coincidence, to be placed there just by coincidence. The way I see it, it was deliberate, this series of parallels, using the term motherhood in a very broad sense, not just biological motherhood, but also in some more general ways concerning godhood, leadership, let's say the national identity of a people and the values that they suppose unites them. I believe that is no coincidence that so many countries around the world claim that their country is their mother, their motherland. And basically, this is my framework. I simplify Soul the Hounds to these 3 plot lines that are actually just one element being described in different ways. You have the story of Rake, which is reaching its final point. Story of Nimander, that is just starting. And then you synthesize that into Harlow, which binds the two with the clear and very strong elements of legacy, clearly grief, but most importantly, catharsis and reconciliation. And that leads me to my final point in this video. This might be the most controversial point I'll make here. I see a lot of people saying that Soul the Hounds is about grief. I actually think the author says so himself. I don't think about Soul the Hounds in those terms. I don't think grief is what defines Soul the Hounds. In my opinion, Soul the Hounds is like a painting. Grief is the canvas of that painting, the background. Because what Soul the Hounds discusses and explores needs to be contrasted with something as powerful as the overwhelming grief that goes throughout the entire book. But I don't think that's the point of the novel. At least I don't think of it in those terms. In my opinion, Soul the Hounds is about catharsis and reconciliation. About coming to terms with things. Moving past conflicts. It's easy to say that this is, I might be quoting Ruth and Bad. It might seem easy to go to thinking that this is overly dramatic and it's just a bunch of emo, diced Andy feeling sad about the universe. But I prefer to look at it into more personal terms. Don't look at it as these characters in a work of fiction. Think of any moment in which you and a loved one have had some differences, have been separated for one reason or another, have come into conflict. And that has resulted in a breaking down of a friendship, of a relationship. It can be familiar, with your loved ones, with your partner. It doesn't matter. This book is an exploration of that, of how things, despite being grim and sad, how things can be mended eventually. Of course, not everything can be mended. You cannot mend the death of a loved one, for instance. And I know from studying the background of this novel that the death of a loved one influences this work a lot. Something with which I can truly relate. But ultimately, I think that what makes this novel, if I was to synthesize this into a single theme, it will be that. It wouldn't be grief. So the hounds is not about grief. Grief is the background on which the actual theme is contrasted. And basically, that's my framework for Toll the Hounds. Now, why the anatomy of Toll the Hounds? Well, if you see the image, either in the, I'm not sure if it's on the thumbnail or if it's in your screen right now. I haven't made a decision on how to present this. This image has an assembly of bones. That's how the lower leg bone structure works. So after thinking about this sometime, I realized that more or less that's the structure of the novel that we just described. The lives of Mander and Anomander being one bone and the other, and Harlow being this connective tissue that binds the two bones together and allows the lower leg to work. So I don't know, the title is more or less tongue-in-cheek, but I thought it was an interesting visual representation of all this theory. Now, I think from here I'm going into a more general theory on how to interpret the entire Malazan Book of the Fallen. So let me know what you think, and basically this ends this episode. Thanks for listening, and have a good day. Bye.